Hey, what's up, life designers? Welcome to Intentional Tuesdays. I really struggled this week about whether or not to do this episode. Certainly, on one hand, I felt an obligation to keep up to my commitment to do a weekly episode, but at the same time, I felt conflicted about doing something that feels relatively trivial in light of the absolutely horrific events of the past week and the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent rioting in many American cities. And I've thought really hard about this. In fact, there's a kind of an interesting quote going around on Facebook. It's a quote from Ben Franklin, and I'm probably going to butcher it a little bit here, but it's something to the effect of, justice will never be served until the unaffected become as outraged as the affected. And it definitely struck me when I heard that, and it occurred to me that it's not quite right. And I'm not one to one up a founding father, but it occurred to me that there's something that's important that happens before that quote, which is justice will never be served until the unaffected realize they aren't. Realize that they aren't unaffected. And that is what really kind of pushed me over the edge to decide to go ahead and publish something this week about what's going on in our country. I struggled again with the question of, is this my lane? This isn't really my area of expertise, but it all just comes back to that quote. There's no such thing as someone who is unaffected. If you are a member of this society, you are absolutely affected. This absolutely is your lane. You have a perspective, and that perspective is worthwhile. That perspective is necessary. So with that, I'm going to offer you my perspective on what's going on right now. And I hope you find it useful. At a minimum, I know that simply saying it out loud will be useful for me. So with that, let's dive right in. So I mentioned that I was struggling with the decision about whether or not to do this, and part of it was because again, this isn't really my lane. My beard is going to be going crazy, by the way, today, so I apologize. But part of it was something else. On one hand, I feel incredibly convicted about what happened and what is happening. At the same time, I feel conflicted. This is a complicated matter, and on some level, I feel very conflicted. My trust has been violated for certain. All of our trusts have been violated. But at the same time, I feel a bit of conflict in how I feel about the situation, the original events, as well as the subsequent events, the rioting and the reaction. So what I came to decide is that paradoxical feeling of being conflicted and simultaneously convicted is the right mix. And I would suggest that if you don't feel that way, if you feel entirely convicted or if you feel entirely conflicted, then you are probably not thinking about this quite as deeply, quite as closely as you need to be. So let that be the backdrop to the rest of what I talk about here today. I think we humans suffer from a very serious flaw in our wiring. And it's our affinity for simplicity. We simply do not like complexity, and we try to reduce everything that we see in our lives to the simplest explanation, because that makes us feel comfortable. I mean, if I were to put an equation, if I were to put the fraction 8 over 4 or 4 over 8, most of us would have the immediate inclination to try to reduce that fraction to something that's easier to understand. And this makes sense because it's probably a survival instinct. to understand things in the simplest terms, and to be able to make sense of them quickly when we are under stress and strain is probably a very useful tendency. Unfortunately, life isn't simple. It's not. And that's where that whole feeling of conflict comes in with regards to understanding this current situation. Nothing about this situation is simple, and anyone who tries to tell you otherwise is either lying to you or they're just unable to understand and appreciate the complexity themselves. So we really have to embrace the complexity of this situation, because otherwise we can't advance the conversation. There's a phrase that comes from improv comedy, and it's the phrase, if you've ever, most of you probably know this if you know anything about improv comedy, it's the yes and phrase. Yes and. In improv comedy, you have to always say yes and, because when somebody puts something out there and they say, hey, this is what's going on, if you say no, it shuts down the conversation. So the phrase yes and allows the conversation to continue. It allows the conversation to keep going. And it allows, most importantly, it allows the first person to have the feeling of being heard and the feeling of being seen. So when you look at this situation and you hear people reacting to it, you might have a reaction of, I don't see it the way they see it. And I encourage you to say, yes and. Yes and. I hear what you're saying, and I feel it to be valid and worthy, and there's more to the story. And there's more to the story. This is always the most skillful approach in any conversation. When you hear something in particular that you disagree with, but even when you hear something that you agree with, yes and is always the better solution than no or but or any of the other conflicting interrupters that we like to use. Yes and is the most skillful response, and it's definitely one that would serve us well during these particularly challenging times. There's another important concept that I want to weave in here and then hopefully tie it all together in a way that makes sense. And it's a bit of an axiom that we use in coaching, which is to say, everyone makes the best decision available to them in the moment. Everyone makes the best decision available to them in the moment. And this is a tricky one to get your head around. But the idea here is, life is complex, and each person makes their own decisions, and they, in the moment of making their decision, they will make the best decision that they possibly can based on all of the resources they have available to them. Their intellect, their life experiences, their perspective, their genetics, all of these things come together, and each person makes the best decision available to them in that particular moment. And this is a really useful thing to realize, because once you realize that each person is making the best decision available to them, suddenly you have to grapple with the fact that they made a decision that you wouldn't have made. And that is interesting. You then have to ask yourself, why would they do that? Why would they make that particular decision? And of course, the easy answer is to explain it using your paradigm, using your perspective, and just say, oh, they must believe X, Y, Z, which is what I believe, or they must not believe what I believe, and that explains why they made the decision they made. Unfortunately, that is not yes and thinking. That is the opposite. The skillful response in moments like this, when you see somebody making a decision that doesn't make sense to you, is to get curious about it and to understand what could possibly cause a reasonably rational actor to make the decision that they're making. And something interesting happens once you do that. You then have to grapple with bigger questions questions about systems, questions about bigger picture matters. So what do I mean by big system concerns? There's a couple of different ways that you have to process a situation like the one we're experiencing. One level is the individual level, and that is the most simple level. So that's the one we tend to like to use. The individual level kind of goes like this. Those police officers were absolutely wrong, and they need to be put in prison for the rest of their lives. They committed a violation of trust, a violation of the authority that we've given them, and there's just simply no way to justify or explain their actions. That's the individual level discussion, and I think in this case, it would be hard to argue that every piece of that is correct. But the yes and conversation would take it a bit further. We don't have to choose either or. We don't have to choose to look at the individual and hold the individuals accountable at the expense of looking at the bigger system, at the expense of looking at the bigger picture. So the yes and move in this situation would be, yes, those individuals were absolutely wrong. There's simply no way to justify it, and we shouldn't even try. And those people are part of a system that causes them to make decisions like the ones we saw last week. And there's just simply no question that this is true. There's no question. I am not an expert in the field, but I do have a bit of an experience that I can share with you that I had in the last year. I'm fortunate to live in a town where they have a citizens police academy, and this is a situation where they invite citizens to come to the police station for 8 weeks of training, and basically you learn how police work occurs. And it's a very, very neat program. I learned a ton. Personally, I did it for research for some fiction writing that I'm doing, but it was an amazing experience to see the perspective of this particular organization that I rely on a regular basis to keep order in society and to protect me and to protect the people around me. So it was kind of neat to see that from the inside. But one of the coolest pieces of this experience is that I got to do a ride-along. I got to actually, on 2 separate occasions, do a 4-hour ride-along with a police officer where I was in the car with them, and I would follow the police officer around no matter what they were doing. I would be at their side. And it was a very interesting experience. And I remember the first time, actually I remember it happening both times, as I was walking to the police station to do my ride along. I remember how scared I was. I was absolutely terrified of the idea of doing this ride along. And part of me knew that it was going to be, relatively safe. But part of me said, man, this is a really scary situation. And I can't imagine what it would be like for this to be my job. I can't imagine what it would be like to have to do this on a daily basis as my job. And I suddenly had a different perspective, a different appreciation for the job of being a law enforcement official in a very crazy world. Now notice I'm not in any way justifying the actions of these individuals, these police officers who murdered an unarmed man. Those 2 conversations can exist simultaneously, even though it feels contradictory and it feels like I'm violating some level of my conviction that these people were wrong. I'm not. We as a society have to have nuanced conversations. We have to have yes and conversations in order to move forward. It's the only way. We have to better understand the systems that we have created and the systems that are creating the phenomenon that we are witnessing in the world. And noticing that and having that conversation doesn't mean that we are justifying or that we are putting aside the individual level concerns and the individual level accountability. The 2 things can coexist. This is what yes and thinking is, and this is what systems thinking and complexity means that we have to do. And it works on the other side of the equation as well. If you notice the way people have reacted to the the situation, the rioting, it's very easy for us to see somebody throw a brick through a store owner's window and say, I would never throw a brick through a store owner's window. That's just wrong. There's no way to justify it. But is that really true? If you can't imagine the situation that would cause you to throw a brick through a store window, then I would suggest you're not thinking hard enough. You're simply not. If you look at somebody who chooses to kneel during the national anthem, and you say, I would never kneel during the national anthem, then you are not using your imagination to the fullest extent. You are not envisioning the full capability and the full conviction of your own beliefs. If you can't imagine that you would stand up to your country, then you are forgetting the American Revolution. It's a complex situation. Now, you can, at the same time, you could say, oh man, that just feels like it's disrespectful to the military and to the flag and to everything that our country stands for. That's just disrespectful. I would never do that. But that last bit is where you're making the fumble, where you're making the bad move. The yes and logic would be, man, that is disrespectful. And I wonder what would cause a person to have to do that. What would cause a person to feel like they need to kneel during their national anthem? And get curious about that and ask yourself, what system are we living in that would allow that to make sense to that particular person, and resist the idea of making it an individual conversation about that particular individual and their values and their decision to make to kneel or to throw a brick through a window, and ask yourself, what is the bigger picture? What is the bigger system at work here? And what conversations do we have to have about that? Now, at the same time, I'm not saying that if you catch the person who throws the brick through the window, that person needs to go to jail. That is pretty straightforward. If you choose to make a decision to throw a brick through a window, then you are a danger to society and you need to be accountable for that. But at the same time, we can't dismiss the bigger picture that has created the phenomenon, that's created the sense of rioting. Now, are there people who are rioting? Are there people who are in those movements who are not convicted? Are there people in there who are doing it simply for the ability to steal a TV or who knows what else they're stealing? Of course, yes, and there are absolutely going to be people in those rioting crowds who don't care about George Floyd, who don't care about the fact that black people in America have to live in fear. There's no question that there are people in there who think that. And there are people in there who do think that this rioting is for a reason. It's a yes and, it's a complex situation, and we have to address all of the layers. So if you are not feeling simultaneously convicted and conflicted, then I recommend that you go a little deeper and you talk to some other people. Talk to some people who hold the different opinion from the one that you hold, and do it with curiosity. Do it with the intention of understanding the paradigm from which they come, the reason they hold the beliefs, the convictions that appear to be different than the ones that you hold. And only good things will happen from that conversation. These are the types of conversations that we have to be having. These are the types of things that will allow us to move forward in a productive and healthy way. So I feel like I'm starting to ramble at this point. My beard is behaving relatively well, but nonetheless, I feel like I'm going to draw this to a close. So I hope you found this useful. And like I said, even if you didn't, it was useful for me. So mission accomplished. So that said, I wish you all the best. Look forward to our paths crossing again in the hopefully not too distant future. And until that day, I wish you a prosperous journey. Take care.